Hi, I'm Jan Drucker, and on behalf of Sarah Lawrence College and the Child Development Institute, I want to welcome you here. This is officially called the Thomas Wright Lecture. It's an annual lecture or panel that was founded with a donation from the Leon Lowenstein Foundation to honor Thomas Wright, who was on their board and also on the Sarah Lawrence Board of Trustees. And Tom Wright, when he was going off the board, I guess, many years ago when this was happening, he said that he would like the honor to be involved with the Child Development Institute. So the then director of it, Marjorie Franklin, had the idea of using it as a small endowment rather than spending it on something the first year or so that could go forward. And so for a number of years now, we've had wonderful visitors every July in the areas of child development, education, developmental psych, and we want to thank Leon Lowenstein Foundation for their initial and some subsequent support. Last summer, in our ongoing quest to consider to spend a week each summer, which we call the Empowering Teachers Program, and for which the lecture is a kind of kickoff or keynote, the quest is always to think thoughtfully about teaching, about children, about the lives children lead. And last summer, we thought about Ted Sizer's comment that he could not teach a child he did not know. And that was in a talk he was giving, and the context of it was talking about high schools and class size, and how could you possibly know in any deep way a class of 30 kids or 35 kids or the 120 kids you might see in the course of the day if you're a high school teacher. But the broader context of his remark was about more than just class size. It was about all the things that enable us or prevent us from knowing each child whose life we try to be part of. So last year, some of you were here, and we focused on the children's questions, the questions that children ask, because currently the pendulum has swung so far to the end of asking children questions for which there's a right and wrong answer, starting very early on orally and then getting into multiple choice tests and other such things. So we thought about children's questions, and that was a kind of a deep dive into questions, answers, possible answers, and the people who ask questions, whether it's us or the children or both. And then, so that was a very interesting week, and some of you were there for that week, and then we went home at the end of, and it was late July, and just a few weeks later, Ferguson happened. And one of my thoughts coming only one of them, but one of them coming directly from the Empowering Teachers Week was, oh my goodness, what are children thinking and asking about this? What does this mean to children? And of course, there were a lot of other questions, but that was one of them. And that underlined then a whole range of questions for all of us. And it wasn't the first event, and it wasn't the last, and it wasn't like this past year has been so different than a lot of others in our history, but it certainly made us who are in the academic world come back to school kind of with a different focus, slightly different focus, and worried about things and thinking about things in a slightly different way. And during the past year at Sarah Lawrence, we've had a series of conversations and programs exploring aspects of inequality in America primarily, especially in relation to education. And the achievement gap, as it often is called, although, as I believe it was Pedro Noguera said, or perhaps it was David Johns, they were both here this spring, said it should be called an opportunity gap, not an achievement gap, more properly. I don't know what these gentlemen will think about that, but they can say. And one of those programs in the fall was about higher education in relation to inequality in society. And Josh Bogin, who's to my right, on the far right, was here for that. And then there were some other conversations specifically about education and the access to education at all levels. And then more and more events kept happening, even in the past month, and they contributed more questions to this, to the ongoing complexities of thinking about social justice and injustice throughout our world and close to home. So this week, the Summer Institute is turning its focus to searching for better ways to understand injustice and inequality on multiple levels, and to find ways that our practices can better support justice for each child in each classroom. And today we're very fortunate to have with us two people who are ideally suited to helping us see, contextualize the children we work with in the bigger picture, and help us start to refine our thoughts and articulate our concepts that to go with the many feelings that we all have about various of these issues. These two gentlemen have some things in common. They were both born in Westchester, grew up, went to high school in Westchester, so they're local, even though neither of them live here now. They both went to law school. They both went into civil rights law, and they both have, from that basis, moved in different ways into very interesting affiliated areas, and have both contributed enormously to, I would say, the cause of justice on multiple levels in America and the world. So we're first going to hear from Stephen Hawkins, my near right. Steve is the executive director of Amnesty International USA, and I learned that Amnesty International USA is the largest of the national, Amnesty International, if I've got this right, is a collection of national organizations, but the USA is the largest, and I guess maybe in some ways the most active, but we'll hear from that, but certainly not because we have the answers to social justice issues in the US. And it's a good thing that we have such a large branch because we need it. After attending Harvard and NYU School of Law, Steve spent time with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and he represented African American men facing the death penalty throughout the Deep South. You can imagine what kind of challenge that must have been. And during those years, he brought litigation that saved many lives. And then he continued by working with groups, partnership of organizations, as director of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. Starting in one place and then a larger circle of similar concerns. He's worked at foundations which advocate for human rights and social justice. He's been the executive vice president, chief program officer of the NAACP. He worked in South Africa in support of Nelson Mandela, and maybe we'll hear about that, I'm not sure, but another whole arena to which he devoted his talents and engagement. And now at Amnesty International, there's a confluence of grassroots advocacy, youth engagement, and the empowerment of people in America to fight for human rights. And although we often seem to feel we have a premium on that, we don't, and we need Steve and his organization. Josh Bogin, after graduating from high school in Westchester, went to Oberlin College and worked in an urban studies program, which brought him into his first contact with urban education, though not with education, probably, not your first contact with education, but with that kind of, well, you went to school, and he comes from a family of people concerned with early childhood. He's also a musician, but then he went to Temple Law School and worked in legal services in Philadelphia, and then he went to work for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, Washington. And in this context, you see how their pathways wind together and parallel in some cases. At the DOJ, he focused on school discrimination cases and housing. And that brought him to be a key player in the case of the United States versus Yonkers Board of Ed, which many of you know a lot about, and which is viewed as a landmark case in regard to its resolution of tying housing, law, and educational access together, but it is still very much a troubling and troubled issue in Yonkers, even though it's coming up on a lot of years since that time. And then after 10 years at the Justice Department, he began working at the intersection of school desegregation, education, law, and currently he is the head of Springfield, Massachusetts Public Schools Magnet School Program. And I think we'll hear something about that, will we? A little bit. A very interesting situation from which he can think about all of his multiple interests in education and access in how children in a fairly large school district get distributed among the schools and what kind of experiences they have. So our plan is to hear first from Steve, stretch a bit, hear from Josh, and then have conversation with them and with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming here today, and it's an honor to be here. And you know, Jan started talking about Ferguson, and it reminded me of being on the ground in Ferguson on West Florissant Avenue back in August of last year, and experiencing really a human rights crisis as it emerged in the United States. In my younger years, I had been in Northern Ireland before the Good Friday Accords were signed, and Ferguson reminded me so much of what it had been like to be on the ground in Northern Ireland, and to see the sort of the journey that I think our country's been on over this last year. But today I want to talk about inequalities as I see them in education through three prisms. The first prism being gender, the second race, and the last wealth. And I'm going to start by getting us to think about education as a human right, since that's my field as I've moved. As Dr. King said a long time ago, we must move from an era of civil rights to human rights, and I believe that. And how education is defined as a human right in the international arena. I'm going to quote from the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights from 1966, so we're talking about almost 50 years ago. And the covenant says that education is both a human right in itself, but it is also what we call an empowerment right, because you realize other human rights through education. And as an empowerment right, to quote from the covenant, education is the primary vehicle by which economically and socially marginalized adults and children can lift themselves out of poverty and obtain the means to participate fully in their communities. Education has a vital role in empowering women, safeguarding children from exploitation and hazardous labor and sexual exploitation, promoting human rights and democracy, protecting the environment, and controlling population growth. Increasingly, education is recognized as one of the best financial investments that governments can make. So that's the United Nations talking a half century ago, and I would dare to say that what was written then is still true now. So education is this human right, it's an empowerment right, it's been defined as an indispensable right. I look at the UN Millennium Goals that were adopted in 2000. The first goal is to eradicate poverty. The second goal is to achieve universal primary education. The third goal is to eliminate gender disparity in education. So the UN seeing these as fundamental, and then the Millennium document goes on to say that education is the means by which all the Millennium Goals will be achieved. So education globally is seen as a primary vehicle, and I'm going to explore that more as I talk. So first, the prism of gender. 2 years ago now, I had the privilege of meeting Malala Yousaf, who it was May, and I was in Dublin, and Amnesty was honoring Malala, and she was still in school, so she had caught a plane, got off the plane with her book bag, apologized that she couldn't stay long because she had to catch a plane back because she had homework to finish. But here was an extraordinary 15-year-old who 2 years earlier had been shot in the head by the Taliban in Pakistan and had lived through that ordeal and had, at that point, moved with her father and mother to London and to pursue her education and to still be an advocate for the rights of young girls in Pakistan. And as you all know, Malala just this past year won the Nobel Peace Prize at 17 years old, the youngest person ever in the history of the Nobel Peace Prize to have such an honor. And Malala was incredibly poised for a 15-year-old in front of 2,000 people at this major conference center in Dublin. But she talked about what education meant to her and why she defied all the odds and wanted to pursue her education, and why the bullet and the fragments still lodged in her head would not stop her from pursuing her dream of an education and wanting to see that for all the young girls in Pakistan. So the prism of gender as a human, in this context. We know that girls are not in school in 3 countries that have over 1 million girls not in school. Nigeria at 5.5 million, Pakistan at 3 million, and Ethiopia at a little over 1 million. Without education, what does that mean? It means that girls are with education. I'll frame it in the converse. With education, girls would be less likely to get married at an early age. With education, there would be a narrowing of the pay gap between men and women. And with education, women would be more likely to find work. Places like Brazil have seen where 30% of the women in the country are employed with less than a primary degree. And then with secondary education, the number goes above 60%. And that's probably indicative of many places. But more importantly, what does it mean for the future of civil society? It means that without developing the education opportunities of half of your population, its impact on government, its impact on the development of countries, but more broadly, the impact that it has on the world, the impact of what's lost, the opportunities that are lost not only for the young girls and their lives, but for the future of science, for the future of engineering, for the future of medicine, for the future of poetry, for all of our combined destinies. And that's why Silicon Valley and some of the entrepreneurs out there have been pushing in their own right to see young girls and an investment in the education of young girls in India and elsewhere, with an understanding that there's a future talent pool out there that needs to be developed. And so it's a fascinating way that we need to begin to think about the world and the importance of young girls being educated and reaching their full potential. It gets me thinking about what it means for implications of the work of Amnesty, for example. You know, how might we create a whole new class of refugees that will allow young girls and create a pipeline out of countries where young girls are denied education. The world witnessed the Boko Haram, kidnapping the young girls in Nigeria, still not found, and so I think it's been a wake-up call to the world, but I can see the potential for a pipeline that could be created and needs to happen. What I could also see as implications for potentially your work is that how children who then come to the United States, whether young girls come ill-prepared for the classroom, or the lack of expectation of their success, the lack of valuing of their success, and how do we, correct that and be cognizant of it. So I'm talking, as you can see, in some global dimensions, but connecting it as well to what I think are incredibly important pathways for not only the success in this country but abroad. The connection here, would be that we hear a lot about Black men and boys initiatives, and I certainly have friends who say, well, what about the girls? And it's not like there are opportunities, in abundance for young girls in poverty in this country either. So, in our own way, we can play into these gender biases, which I think can be incredibly destructive. So, moving on, I want to talk about the prism of race and inequality. Changing demographics. So the recent Census Bureau report that came out just June 25th of this year, and some of you may have heard it on NPR as I did, but children younger than 5 years old are now, as an age group, have now reached the minority-majority status, where over 50% of those children under the age of 5 in the United States today are children of color. So what that means for our population demographics is, quite frankly, this is a point of departure from the history of the United States as we've known it. And what that poses for challenges in the public education in the future. And I'm gonna just read a couple of comments that some thoughtful folks have made just recently on that. Coming from the president of the Southern Education Fund, Kenton McGuire, over the decades, we have not managed to reduce the variation in performance between kids of color and white kids. And we haven't closed the gap between advantaged kids and disadvantaged kids. So now we have to figure out how to do something we've never done before, and that is do it for the majority. It's very changing demographics. And we know the demographers tell us that by 2042, the entire country will be minority majority, and 3 states, I think, now have already reached that status, right? So this is where we're headed. The head of the Civil Rights Project at UCLA, Patricia Gandara, said, "The whole notion of being minority is that you are marginalized and have a second-class status. But what does that mean in this new context? When these students are at the margins with respect to achievement, but at the center with respect to the population, how do we reconcile that?" Incredible questions. Looking at the makeup of teachers in the classroom and those demographics, in 2011-2012 school year, 82% of the 3.24 million public school teachers in the United States were non-Hispanic whites, while 7% were non-Hispanic blacks and 8% were Hispanic. And that's data from the National Center for Education Statistics. Will that change? Does it need to change? These are all implications for you all to think about. And then lastly, this challenge of diversity in schools with new majorities, with students who speak dozens of different languages, as we see in the United States today. Some of these students come with solid education experience, and then others with lack of schooling. But we talk about English as a second language, but in some areas in the country there may be 30, 40 different languages spoken in a middle school. So those kinds of challenges that we face. Other points that I want to make about race are that, interestingly, the work that Josh did around the Yonkers school system, the legal battles that we fought in the past, rightly or wrongly, have sort of come to their conclusion as school districts have been deemed, unified, and that the issues around court orders in terms of monitoring school systems have long receded. But then it begs the question, well, what's on the horizon in this new context of minority-majority status? Some are asking, what does it mean to leave so many children behind from the context of national security? So as some of you all know, it was amazing that military leaders, individuals at the Pentagon asked a few years ago, they got behind the funding of early childhood education and the notion that the military is thinking 30 years down the road about who will be its future leaders, and looking at education and the importance of educating everyone from the context of national security. What does this paradigm mean for our economic might in the world? When you look at China and South Korea and how they are, students when you look at the data on 15-year-olds in China and their math skills compared to the US. So these issues are profound for the United States in terms of ranging from economics to questions around national security and probably everything in between. And as we reach this tipping point in the country, and as I move on from this prism of race, it then gets me thinking about how the power shifts in the country, and whether in that space there will be new thoughts and new thinking around education as we know it. Who knows? We have been under one mode of thinking about public education, its value, and how to tackle it. But there may be some new forms of thinking that emerge, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts, which takes me really to my last prism around income inequality. The way I look at it is education is seen as a scarce commodity in the United States, in the same way healthcare was. You know, there's only so much of it that's good. You want to make sure to get your piece that's good. God help everybody else. and it's such a different vision of universal education, quality education for all, right? It's a notion of scarcity. And people can do very vicious things in a moment of scarcity. We know that we have incredible income inequality within the country. Just, you know, looking at figures from 2014, the CEO of Walt Disney made $47 million, over 1,300 times what his average workers made. And that's just one company. But Walt Disney as opposed to Walmart, so just to give you all a sense that it's a universal problem. But does equitable funding need to be one of these areas that's rethought? You know, we've had this experiment with privatization via charter schools, but we know, however you feel about charters, that it's insufficient to meet the need. What will be our plan for the future that addresses education in some new fundamental way? What will be our plan? You know, healthcare has finally been reimagined in the country, and healthcare was the other, in my thinking, healthcare was the other area where most Americans operated from this notion of a scarce commodity. But it's been rethought. How does education get rethought? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm naming it here. I am concerned when I see movements afoot in Congress, like what's being kicked around now, that dollars would travel with the child, and maybe you all have heard this, where if a child from, for example, the inner city gets a chance to go to the school in the suburb, or to a particular school, the resources, the tax dollars of that child would sort of travel with her or him. And, you know, that could have grave implications for some schools. But these are some of the things that I am hearing within the Beltway in Washington, and maybe you all have as well. The last thing I'll say about income inequality, and then I'll turn it over to Josh, is that when I was at the NAACP, we did a report where we wanted to look at the trade-offs in the country between education and incarceration. You know, and we've all heard the statistics. You know, more young black men are in prison in California, for example, than there are in pursuing higher ed degrees. So we took what has come to be coined $1 million blocks, and what that is you can look at any sort of neighborhood within a city, and you can look at a poor neighborhood, and you can see the dollars that are spent within that community to incarcerate people. And that's why these incredibly poor communities like in Bed-Stuy and Brooklyn or a place like that have become, the criminologists began to call them $1 million blocks, because the greatest public support being offered to the residents in those communities was through the penitentiary, and incredible resources. So we were doing this report, and I was head of programs, so I asked the staff, I said, well, why don't we, and you can do sophisticated mapping. I said, why don't we map, and when we looked at 3 cities, I said, why don't we map an overlay of the dollars that are spent on education in those same communities? And probably to know, I'm sure it wouldn't shock anyone here to find out that those same communities where the most money was spent on incarceration, they got the least funding around education. And it was such an amazing thing to just see sort of pop out. And just think, just suspend belief for one moment and think if, for just 1 year, the money that was spent in a place like Bed-Stuy or Brownsville, or you name the community, East Palo Alto, just think for one moment, if the millions of dollars that were spent on incarceration, just for that 1 year, was flipped and spent on education in those same communities, and maybe incarceration got the education budget. But that doesn't happen, right? And we've seen that education, and the report goes on to talk about, education and incarceration get funded out of the same general pot in most states. And not surprisingly, education dollars have been chewed away on over the years because of the juggernaut of the growth of mass incarceration. We have 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States. Big article in last week's Economist on the growth of the American prison population. To put that in context, when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1981, there were 800,000 people in prison. So we tripled it over that time period. And there's movement afoot now to rethink all of that. But suffice it to say that the growth has come at the cost of education. And you can look at any state and just see how the education pie has just shrunk and shrunk and shrunk over the decades. So I'm going to stop there. I've answered no questions, but I've hopefully at least given you all some thought around education as a human right and its empowerment as a right, its importance globally, and how people are thinking about it from everywhere from military leaders to Silicon Valley to the UN, and then the prisms of race and gender and income inequality. So thank you all.
Jan's introduction and the end of Stephen's speech made me think of the Woody Guthrie song, Why, oh why, oh why. Because, goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. I am quite flattered to be invited and to have been invited by Jan, who almost feels like family to me, although I'd never met her until this afternoon, to discuss what I also consider to be the crucible issue of our time: how to make public schooling a critical and sustainable foundational piece of our democracy. I'm also really excited, and I told him this after just connecting for a few minutes, to share the opportunity with Steve, whose resume and passion for justice speaks for itself. Steve will remember, with me, an old Supreme Court desegregation case known as Gleen versus County School Board. For purposes of our work today, the details of the case aren't important. It was one of many of the Supreme Court's tortured, on the Supreme Court's tortured journey from before Brown versus Board of Education to the day the court finally lost patience with school boards who were determined not to eliminate racial discrimination in schools, and finally said school districts must end dual systems at once. But here's the part I wanted to get at. In Gleen, the court recounted that the end goal of desegregation was to have not one system of black schools and one system of white schools, but rather just schools. I'm going to call this the court's equal opportunity principle. This principle formed the basis of Brown, later the Lau versus Nichols decision that placed requirements on school districts to serve non-English speaking populations, the court's many rulings in ensuring the rights of students with special needs, decisions affecting women's rights via Title IX, and arguably most recently the court's decision affirming as a constitutional matter the rights of all to marry on an equal basis. All conversations about social justice issues in America eventually lead back to this equal opportunity principle. In a democracy, all citizens should be able to participate in decision-making as well as the provender of the society without regard to race, color, ethnicity, religion, income, gender, sexual orientation, marital status, first language, etc. So, a few questions. How many of you have at least one parent who graduated from high school? Raise your hand. How about two parents who graduated from high school? How many have or had one parent with a college degree? Raise your hand. About two parents with a college degree. And what about with a postgraduate degree? Two parents with a postgraduate degree? How many of you are fluent in a language other than English? And how many of you would struggle to understand me if I was to suddenly start speaking in Spanish? What about Arabic, Somali, Nepali? I actually raised these questions not so much to talk about the challenges for non-native English speakers, but rather to talk about the challenges for non-native school speakers. And here's what I'm talking about. Some kids come to school ready to go, not just because they're well-nourished physically or even emotionally, but because they've been prepared for the traditional culture of school, how to listen to the teacher, how to be compliant, how to sit still even when everything in your body is telling you to jump out of your seat. They come with the belief that the teacher is like a surrogate parent, to be honored and respected, even if not loved. School as an institution is viewed at home as a safe and supportive and important place. Obviously, I mention this to compare the idea of school as a safe haven with the way school is viewed by many, many kids and families across the country. You get a call from the teacher, your child must have done something wrong. You get an invitation to come to school, you're wary. And no matter how much hope you feel with Barack Obama in the White House, school is still viewed as part of an unfair system, even if you have no way to really describe how that system works. In her seminal work, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander describes many aspects of America's social and legal systems that operate, in her view, intentionally to cut away black males from the mainstream of America's economic and political systems. Now, I'm not even sure that I agree with all of the elements of that analysis, but what's far more important to me is that there is credible evidence to support it. And most important, people living with that perception are walking through our schools with a huge extra burden. My guess is that most of us who work in education were good students. Maybe not the best, but probably pretty good. For educators, such early school success can be a serious trap, in many ways a handicap. It's a bit like passing Go. If you've played Monopoly, raise your hand. Okay. How many of you hate playing Monopoly? There you go. So when you pass Go and collect $200, you smack your lips in internal celebration. That's sort of the idea. When you land in jail, you don't pass Go, you don't collect $200, and you fester until you roll doubles or pay a fine while your friends are scooting around the board, amassing property and getting rich. It's amazing how many board games are built in some way on this premise. Roll a lucky roll, go to the promised land. Roll the wrong number by chance, land in the poorhouse, in jail, on the park bench, in the hospital, and absolutely, positively never get into the promised land. Most games have winners and losers, but these games, games of chance, frighteningly mirror our own world. Only in our world, one can reasonably predict who the winners and losers are likely to be. Now, anyone who has studied the history of public education in this country knows that Jefferson and others of his time, considered progressive on the subject by many generations of scholars and educators, believed that the role of school was to socialize the country's youth to be able to farm, work in factories, perpetuate the basic societal norms and order. An upper 10% would need to be educated to lead the country, thus the skill of compliance, doing as you were told. It actually served a purpose, at least for some. And it didn't really matter if school in no way spoke to you. When I was in high school, I had the good fortune of working as a volunteer in the New Rochelle pre-kindergarten program. My mom, a trailblazer in early childhood education, was a trailblazer, and I really wouldn't be here speaking about any of this stuff if it hadn't been for her inspiration. My work in classrooms of 3- and 4-year-old children, under the guidance of some of the most able teachers I've ever come to know, began a lifelong eye-opening process for me about what kids bring to the table with them from the earliest ages and how easy it is for us to screw them up. It's hard to stay focused on what is right for kids, and I believe that it's this principle that needs our greatest attention today. When I worked for many years litigating school desegregation and housing cases for the Civil Rights Division, working feverishly to advance the equal opportunity principle, I went through a bit of an evolution, and Steve and I talked about it a little bit before. As I was completing my work on the Yonkers school desegregation case, as wonderful a professional experience as any young civil rights lawyer could ever ask for, I began to face a nagging question. In essence, my question was, what if none of this matters? What if, after all the hard work, it turns out that when we have not black schools or white schools, but just schools, all we have in the end is just schools. Let's not minimize the accomplishment. Brown and its progeny were surely major triumphs, short-lived in many ways because of the reactionary politics that followed, and a triumph that needs ever vigilant support and reinforcement. But let's get back to schools themselves. What if we all got the emphasis wrong, or at least only got it partially right? It's important that black and white and all kids not go to schools based on skin color. We can all agree on that. Race, ethnicity, we can all agree. Not black schools or white schools, but just schools. But what if we were to insert into the equal opportunity principle the adjective lousy? Suppose instead of lousy black schools and lousy white schools, we were to end up with just lousy schools. We'd all be wondering what the big civil rights fuss was about. And that's my point. For education to have any meaning as a vehicle for moving to a just society, we have to have more than just schools. To be sure, we need to pay attention to the idea of having just schools. So what do I mean by just schools? I'm talking about a place where kids feel safe, where they feel a connection to the excitement they live with in their own minds, where they feel like people understand them when they talk about how the wind across their faces feels, who love the fact that when they are so excited they can't sit still for hours on end, who like making up stories and sharing them, who love to build things and create wonderful stories about the things they build, who have stories from their own lives that they want to write about, even sometimes at the expense of reading Charles Dickens's stories from his life. If we are mandating education, there needs to be something in it for the mandatees. If it's not going to be a job on a farm or in a factory, we need to have some rationale for what exactly it is that we're trying to do that is more than warehousing children like sheep. It has been said that the fixation on testing that has been growing at an accelerated pace since before the advent of No Child Left Behind, and that's been perpetuated, unfortunately in my estimation, with this administration's education policy was at its root an effort to ensure that school districts and states show more than a blind eye to the equal opportunity principle. Thus, by assessing subgroups frequently, we could put our fingers on who was being underserved. Fine, as far as it goes, but what if the cure, seemingly endless testing, is as bad as the underlying disease? We hear today from educators, many of whom I agree with about many important things, that it's essential to assess frequently to be sure teachers are in a better position to reflect on what is and is not working in their instructional practice. The problem with this is that students become guinea pigs in this formulation, and we hear precious little about the impact of poor test performance on a student's self-esteem, a student's belief in his or her capacity to be successful in school, and long-term about a child's conversations with self about where he or she fits in the world. Remember how crummy it feels to get that go directly to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200 chance card? I know how I feel when I don't do something well. I question not only my preparation, but also my innate ability to be successful in that venture. Now, I do think that we do some things well in schools, and I don't want this to come off as everything we do in schools is all wrong, everything we do in schools is the same as we did it 50 years ago, although I do hearken back to a song of Tom Paxton from 50 or more years ago where he asks, what did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? And one of the verses is, I learned that policemen are my friends. I learned that justice never ends. I learned that murderers die for their crimes, even if we make a mistake sometimes. So, school districts, unfortunately, are a lot like ocean liners, only they don't get you to the other side of the ocean. We know that students are not achieving at levels we'd hoped for. We know that more and more black and brown students are being suspended and placed in special ed classes, often irrespective of need. We know that dropout rates are painfully high in urban areas and more so by far among so-called minority group populations. And whether you believe that the rapid increase in black and brown populations in American prisons is the result of intentionally discriminatory practices, we certainly know that, as Steve points out, far, far too many of our black and Hispanic young men are taking the short route on the school-to-prison train. What makes the conversation relevant to this particular gathering, I think, is that bad schools and bad schooling, regardless of whether you accept the it's intended theory, are, to put it bluntly, screwing our kids. And screwing our most needy kids the most. For equal educational opportunity to have real value for kids, the education we offer in our schools must have value to begin with. My mom was too humble and too much a product of her times to publicly decry the foundational approaches of our nation's K-12 educational organization and practices. She was focused on getting it right with 3- and 4-year-old children. And as many of you in this room no doubt get innately, it is there where we need to start. Malaguzzi's observations of post-war children in the little town of Reggio Emilia led him to core understandings of how kids inspire and push themselves, with a little help from those around them with the wisdom and understanding to nurture them forward into other realms of the universe than those they already were discovering on their own. My mom's personal passion was blocks. I spent a lot of time with our wonderful set of big wooden blocks, and later, perhaps coincidentally, turned out to have pretty good mathematical understandings. When I first discovered Cuisenaire rods after reading about John Holt's work, I found myself thinking about my days with my blocks. My mom was convinced that playing with blocks laid the groundwork for deep mathematical understanding, for accelerating problem-solving skills, for teaching self-discipline, for what we now refer to as inquiry-based learning, even for social interaction and fluency. My sisters and I used to laugh at her every time she would talk about blocks, but we knew at the same time that she had it nailed. How many of you in the room work with children less than 6 years old? And how many work in elementary schools or middle schools? Okay, a little bit. High schools? All right. So if lousy schooling benefits nobody, then beyond continuing to fight on behalf of the equity principle, we must also be prepared to combat lousy schooling, to take another phrase from that same Gleen decision, root and branch. In 2004, I was part of a once-in-a-blue-moon opportunity, and I'll talk more with you about this perhaps tomorrow or later on. The Gates Foundation issued a grant to expeditionary learning schools to start a dozen small secondary schools in economically poor areas with the overarching goal of 100% of graduates enrolling in college of some kind. In Springfield, I was already doing some work with the EL organization, and I was looking for a model to match up with our pre-K to eighth grade Montessori magnet school. The district bought onto the idea of moving forward with a new 6th to 12th grade expeditionary learning school, and our proposal was introduced actually with a quote I found from what I still consider to be John Holt's seminal work, How Children Fail. And Holt basically talked about, he said that a child is most intelligent when the reality before him arouses a high degree of attention, interest, concentration, involvement, when he cares most about what he's doing. And we want to improve our classrooms, he said, not just so that school will be a pleasant place, but so that children in school will act intelligently and get into the habit of acting intelligently. The case against boredom in school is the same as the case against fear. It makes children behave stupidly, some on purpose, most because they cannot help it. If this goes on long enough, as it does in school, they forget what it's like to grasp at something as they once grasped at everything with all their minds and senses. They forget how to deal positively and aggressively with life and experiences, to think and say, I see it, I get it, I can do it. But here's the tough part. The solutions go beyond policy. They're not simply a matter of belief. While we who think we know what is wrong might comfortably say it's not rocket science, in reality, there's a lot about making schools work that is far more complex than we would like it to be. Here's an example. What came to be known as the Springfield Renaissance School is now a mentor school in the Expeditionary Schools Network and is widely believed to be a beacon of hope for new ways of doing school in Springfield. One core belief at Renaissance is that there should be no tracking. To the contrary, there's a strong commitment to heterogeneous grouping, a tool for ensuring that no racial or ethnic group is getting preferential treatment, and that all students will be held to appropriately high expectations and standards. One of the reasons I've stayed in my job as magnet director is that I had kids of school age and wanted them to go to public schools I could believe in. What better way to believe in a school than to give birth to the vision behind its creation? Renaissance seemed like the answer, a way to get them safely and smartly from 6th through 12th grade. But when they hit the heterogeneous classes there, they found themselves bored to tears. And my kids are not exceptional students. Of course, they're exceptional kids. With a swath of reading levels in each class, from kindergarten to college, and with teachers who had only modest training in differentiating instruction, you had a bevy of classroom management issues that produced the same levels of unhappiness and discontent that one might find in any more traditional schooling environment. So a new teacher finds herself or himself in a classroom of 28 students, all with considerably varying skills. The teacher is trying and working as hard as he or she can to the point of exhaustion, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with who've ever been in a classroom, to come up with lessons that will challenge each student appropriately. Most students are with the program, but a few of them sleep ritualistically in the back of the room, and a few others ignore your efforts to keep them engaged, and instead create disruptions that you are not able to control. You look to your core beliefs and find little help there. One of the mantras at Renaissance School is that one gets smart through hard work and through being nice. It is a core foundational piece that accompanies Cesar Chavez's "Si se puede," yes we can. The departing founding principal, in his graduation remarks last month, rejected the notion that the school is beating the odds, opting instead for the idea that the school is measuring up. In my experience, teachers are not much different than kids. This should come as no surprise, since we all probably remember something significant about being kids. It should be no surprise, then, that teachers still read the newspaper at faculty meetings, that many of them kibitz in the back of the room, that there's a lot of knee bouncing during professional development sessions. The question for us at this gathering is how to improve schools and how to improve teaching. It's one thing to understand what ails schools, but without great teaching, even the most well-intended school reform effort is doomed to failure. And much as we wish it would be the case, precious few individuals come into this world born to teach. Teaching is to some extent an art form, just as recognizing the difference between a 95-mile-an-hour fastball and an 88-mile-an-hour curveball might be. The difference between teaching and playing baseball, however, is that there are no major leagues for the absolute best teachers. Every teacher needs to work at learning the craft. Like doctors and lawyers, there is a need to learn the ins and outs of effective practice, to learn strategic teacher moves, to recognize when it's time to abandon the lesson plan that isn't working with your Tuesday group, even though it was so successful on Monday. Teachers need to understand why the best practices in early childhood education are relevant. If I was king of the forest, I'd ensure that every teacher, every kindergarten through 12th grade teacher have the experience of an internship with pre-K students, and then another with each succeeding level of instructional practice. We hear so often from high school teachers about how kids come to them lacking essential skills. We hear the same from middle school teachers. I think it's time that these teachers at least have the grounding in developmentally oriented practice to know who these students of theirs actually are. But it's also critical for all teachers not to turn a blind eye to recent research, to what we've learned, for instance, about the brain. Does the brain fire more consistently for kids playing video games? It's a troubling thought, but relevant information for us to process as we contemplate best instructional practices. Additionally, teachers need to know their content. You can have the best intentions in the world, be the most social justice-oriented person alive, but if you cannot write yourself, if you not grasp core math or science concepts, you are not helping our kids to become our democracy's next generation of leaders. And that, as Steve indicated, is truly what this conversation is about. We need leaders who are comfortable questioning the status quo. For our students to learn that they will be supported in doing this, and for them to learn the concepts of tolerance and mutual respect that undergird a functioning democracy, they need to know that their teachers are willing to take the risks needed on their behalf. It's a tall order, particularly for new teachers, as bureaucracies are not built to be responsive to demands for change. Still, it would be the height of arrogance for any of us to presume to argue that a belief in true democracy, a belief in cultural competency, a belief in gender equity, a belief in righting the wrongs of a terribly stacked social and economic and legal system, that all of these beliefs taken together will make school a worthwhile place for students. Our job must be to build structures that give students support. There must be no exceptions for high academic expectations, but those expectations must be activated in ways that engender trust and engagement. Building school culture at every organizational level is something most schools don't address well. In Springfield, we've created some different magnet school models that address this cultural piece, some better than others. One such piece in the expeditionary learning context blends an advisor-advisee program known as CREW, where groups of kids are together for several years with the same adult, with practices such as student-led family conferences and critical public passage portfolios, which I'll talk more about if you're interested either later today or tomorrow. Education in the 21st century is not for the faint of heart. It is truly a war on behalf of our kids and on behalf of our democracy. There is no question about it. We need better trained teachers. We need better trained leaders. We need to be prepared to mobilize politically to make the case that without just schools, we cannot aspire to have a just society. And in these times, as the troubled history of our past year tells us, there's no future in an American society that is not just. Thus, not lousy schools for the rich and lousy schools for the poor, not lousy schools for blacks and browns and lousy schools for whites, not lousy schools that harm the disenfranchised more because they have fewer resources with which to dig out of their holes. Not lousy schools. Good schools. Just schools. Thank you.
I read something just recently that was an op-ed, there's something called Op-Education and something called Education Week Teacher. But basically it was on June 30th, an African-American woman named Marilyn Rames, who writes, this column wrote, "Racial injustice is rooted in the legacy of a lie." And the lie is that basically white people are superior to other people. And if, to the extent that she may be right, and that that permeates our society and permeates our schools, what, you know, like, how can we think about that? How can we begin to go about that? Because I think about Jefferson, and of course, you know, that was one model, which is it can be a good school if only 10%, the meritocracy bound are educated beyond the third grade or whatever. And of course, it doesn't matter that there aren't, I mean, in his view, there wouldn't be girls there or non-whites. So that wasn't even an issue. It would be, that there was no question about that. But a lot of these schools a lot of schools that you're talking about that are on a school level racially balanced or integrated or are so tracked and socially self-selecting, and that people view it as a good school because for a certain group of kids, it's doing whatever people want it to do. But clearly by, you know, your definition of it, it's not a good school because it's not a just school and in any sense. So how much of the whole, of all our problems are based on this lie and related lies, which is that, you know, we don't really have to worry about everybody because whether it's income or gender or race, there are certain people that are the prime candidates for whatever society has to give, and as long as they're getting it, it's okay. I know that's that might seem like a left field kind of quote, but I wonder if you can respond to that at all.
Just one thing that I would say is that you've articulated this to the extent that the civil rights community weighed in on No Child Left Behind. That was why they weighed in support. You talked earlier about opportunity gap versus achievement gap, and the idea was that if we assess cohorts of students, then even if you have a school that has been traditionally identified as a great school, if the minority students in that school or the poor students in that school are failing, while you have some successes among a smaller cohort of students in the school, this will give us the information we need to be able to put action steps into place to move such a school forward. And I don't think anybody can argue with that as a basic idea. I think that notion, the notion of how we do that assessment and where we go with those assessments, has taken on a life of its own that's extremely problematic. But I think that's where this idea of No Child Left Behind school reform came from, at least from the perspective of those pushing from the advocates for minority school children. I don't know what your take is.
I think that's right, but it goes to my point that we end up treating no education as this scarce commodity, and whether you take the view that some children will be are dispensable under that model, the reality is that that's how it ends up operating. You'll have a school system where some children will achieve and others will not, and so yes, the civil rights community got behind No Child Left Behind, and we see where it's gone. The other thing to overlay on it, though, is that how education, the assault on education, the war on education, is also playing out in terms of how it gets privatized. And when we look at the 70s, it was the privatization of the military, and before then, everything was military was a public entity. Now it's become extremely privatized. In the 80s, it became prisons, and now wherever there's a lot of public dollars, there will be entrepreneurs who want them, and so the assault on education now has been around the privatization in different ways, which definitely then will tie in even more to the notion of scarcity. I don't know how you feel about that as a phenomenon, but it worries me tremendously.
Yeah, I think well, and what we saw, interestingly enough, in the South, when so 1954, you have Brown versus Board of Education. The Gleen case that I talked about wasn't until 1968, and the next year came a case where the school from Mississippi, where the Supreme Court basically said, all right, time is up. The time for all deliberate speed is over. You have to desegregate, dismantle your dual system. And then finally, 3 years after that, came what came to be known as the Swan Case, where the Supreme Court said, even if it means putting kids on buses and moving them out of their neighborhoods, if that's what it takes to break down this firmly entrenched dual system, then so be it. Well, what ended up happening in many parts of the South is the creation of what were known to us as private Christian academies. So them that could, other than them who cared, them that could, got out. They created a whole separate parallel school system that was exclusively for white kids. And I think, we don't see that quite as overt as we don't see many aspects of discrimination as quite as overt in the North. But Steve, I think Steve's absolutely right, that if you consider education as a scarce commodity, then those who have the ability find a way. And I would even go so far as to say that some of it is language fluency. It helps you to, so even if you can't afford private school, if you're one of those who walks into school and school is congruent with everything that you've been taught from the time you were born to the time you're 5 years old, then you're getting a shot, you're getting more of that scarce commodity than somebody for whom the match isn't as good. So I think it's very apt analysis.
It's like waiting for Superman. And to me, the most depressing thing in that whole movie is the notion that parents are holding on to your thing about rolling the dice, you know, the lottery, right? If my child wins this lottery, their life will be made, and if my child doesn't, they're screwed. But anyway, you all must have questions.
Speak up.
Speak up.
You look like you have a question.
I was thinking that the high-stakes testing and things like that are things that are being more imported into the United States, that there are models from other countries that we're also using because the discourse is because that will make us more competitive, internationally. And so I wonder what kinds of comparisons have been made to other countries and the United States. What other models are out there that says that all this testing doesn't work, or that all this testing undermines the quality, certain qualities of instruction. I mean, the only thing I would say, I must add that, I teach African history here, so I would say that in a lot of other countries, the question of opportunity to even enter a classroom is part of what the testing is used for. But that's not what it's supposed to be used for here. So I just wonder what you all would say to that.
Well, I think you're right. Testing, supposedly, if you listen to the people who design tests, they would say that the purpose of most assessments is formative, is to help teachers improve their instructional practice by understanding what the competencies are of their students, or by understanding how much of what they've been trying to do in the classroom has been getting through in a way that's making itself manifest. But somehow or other, this notion of formative assessment has been turned on its ear, and much of the formative assessment is being used for high-stakes purposes. I find it troubling and also challenging that there seems to be a perception that if we reduce the amount of this testing, and if we reduce these, if we eliminate the high-stakes nature, then we will be ipso facto lowering the bar and not having high enough expectations for all of our students. And so, I would say that high expectations are profoundly important, and that high expectations for all students are profoundly important. But I also think that letting teachers and kids and superintendents of schools and school board members all know that if you don't do well enough on these tests, you're going to be judged as a failure, undermines the very purpose for which we're trying to raise these expectations and get a sense of how our instructional practice ties to that. And I think, I'm not an expert on the international models, but I know there's, certainly international comparisons, as Steve mentioned, are showing that we've got some things to consider and think about. I know you hear about Finland a lot. My own feeling is that we need to be careful about international models, though you might be able to educate me some here, Steve, and really focus on what we need to be doing better here with our own kids and our own teachers and our own administrators. I think that there's plenty of room for us to take the best of what we know about assessment for learning, and put it to good use. I just, at this point, I don't see the will politically, either on the strictly political side or on the educational political side. And I think it's very much a matter of will and a matter of public insistence on people taking a different look at this.
I would, my fear is that the American testing model could end up being exported. Political operatives have done that with criminal justice over the years, and we end up exporting a lot of bad policy out of the United States, and it becomes zero tolerance policing in London, for example, and so especially where there's money to be made. So that's my fear, that what has been sort of an English system of testing, which may place people for on various career paths, will become part of this sort of atomized testing that we see in the United States.
I think the little aside that Steve just said about, especially where there's a dollar to be made, it cannot be minimized. And the scary part to me, working in a school district that's pretty prototypical, I would say, is how fast administrators will run to the next thing that gets put in their hands by somebody at the State Department of Education who's gotten this from, somebody working for one of the big mega book publishers that is creating all the tests. And I try really, really hard not to be a conspiracy theorist, because I think it's a slippery slope, and you can end up in a mess if you ascribe conspiratorial intentions to everything. But I do think that the dollar plays a significant role in where all of this has gone.
Just to throw two things in there, to use your term, testing has become privatized. That's really the point, and the hand in glove between testing and textbooks and test marking and all of that. It's so far spread that I'm sure that it's probably already being exported, if not yet. But you're right, we're like Singapore. Singapore maybe has good math, so everybody's got to do Singapore math until, whoops, they're not testing well enough, so then we got to do some other kind of math. But the other point is about the international models. I think that, your point is very well taken, that we can't just say, well, X country does it well, let's do that. X country may be the size of one of our states. X country may have a totally different culture or way, but neither should we say we're so exceptional that we have to only do it our way. And just, there are, in my limited knowledge, there are some national systems where they do well on the high school comparative tests that are given internationally, and they have a lot of testing all along. But in Finland, for example, they don't take standardized tests until high school. Yep. And yet they still score very high. So there are obviously many pathways, Mary, to the, to the eventual goal, and they don't all involve repeated testing. And even in the British system, which I guess is somewhat more open now, but where it used to be at 11, you took a test that projected your future, we're doing it with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. So, if 11 was bad, why,
Right.
what rationale is that for somebody else? Many people, Sarah, and then there.
I just was reflecting on the comment about Finland, because I had some contact with people from actually all the Scandinavian countries at one point a couple of years ago. And what really struck me was not so much the fact that testing is not important in a huge way to any of the countries in Scandinavia. Now, some of them do less well than Finland, but they all do pretty well. It's that their thinking is really about the child and children learning to think and what that means So the depth of what they're struggling with as they work with their educational systems actually brings me back to early childhood. It's what we try to do at the very early childhood level here with every single kid we have in a classroom that might have 27 kids in it. But it disappears as kids get older, and we feel we have to go into something more rigid, tighter, more controllable, because kids are able to think bigger. It doesn't work that way, because that impetus in the beginning carries through. The desire to find out doesn't stop. And I think that's really what hit me. It wasn't about whether testing is going to go out from here to the world. It wasn't about whether the fact that the Scandinavians don't have a whole lot of testing. It wasn't about that. It was the focus of the thinking on the kid. So I'm just sharing that.
Well, you know, I think that the politics of high-stakes testing, as it's come down, you know, now it's to 4-year-olds, now it's to 3-year-olds, whatever, really it requires a response. But if my experience, you know, I've been sort of watching over the past 30 or 40 years as the kind of educational practice that I presume still exists in your early childhood center here gets sort of marginalized, even within the early childhood pre-K universe. And I think that this is where vigilance becomes really important, because and I remember this with my mom, you know, who was a pre-K person, and when she would have to go and deal with the superintendent of schools, it was always a battle, always a struggle, because there wasn't enough heft in the pre-K universe. And I think Steve's point about the military beginning to take note of the importance of educating really young kids and paying attention to that is our guidance here. But I think that the pre-K universe needs to really mobilize and become a significant force in being able to lay out and articulate the reasons that what's going on, what's being pushed down is not consistent with what is best for kids' learning. And that if we look at things a little different, we will achieve a better level of test results. And perhaps we need mobilization around research, more research that needs to demonstrate that.
So I guess that really hits what I feel. How do we get people to hear that? It's how, yeah, and this is a perennial question from listening to Barry Brazelton talk here, 20 years ago, and saying, you know, Ed Ziegler and I keep going down to Washington and we keep trying to tell them, you know, how little kids learn and how young children think. And he said, eventually I figured out if I could find one grandfather up there, I could focus on him, and that might open up a conversation. He said, but we really haven't moved very far. He said, we can't really get anything done or anything done on a larger, you know, on a larger level in terms of people listening to us. So I totally agree with what you're saying. I just hope people will, you know.
Well, MRIs may be the key. Now that they're putting the infants and babies and toddlers into MRIs and watching what happens in their brain when they make human contact. Of course, we don't know yet what the effect of MRIs on children 20 years from now. But it's like that. That's viewed as hard, you know, serious evidence. And when we have an infant development person here, but when babies look at human faces, different things happen in their brain than when they look at screens or inanimate objects or whatever. So, you know, maybe there will be, but there's so many vested interests. Here's we get back to the conspiracy theory. You back there, you wanted to say something, and then she was waiting.
Yeah, I guess my question was about we were talking about how the testing system was originally, another question about testing, how the testing system was originally meant to be a formative assessment But I was wondering what you think about, because I think that there's a sort of this cycle where I think kids now who are from more privileged families are getting tutored for these tests.
Yeah.
Like I was recently babysitting these kids who were very bright, very smart, and their parents were like, they had tutors who were making sure they were going to like ace these tests and never get everything right. So, and yeah, in a case like that, do you think that, like, I mean, it's sort of just a vicious cycle. I mean, what are you supposed to do with something like that, where it's not an assessment of basic level, but these kids are just, their parents are paying money to make sure they'll get higher scores. So it's.
Well, it goes to my point, I guess, about the wealth gap, and so you can create something that is supposed to be a more fair system, supposedly through the testing, but if you have the means to invest in the prep for the testing, then it just puts that thumb back on the scale of sorts. And all the cottage, and it ties into Jan's point about the industry, the private industry that's been created to administer and create the tests, and the private industry that's been now the cottage industry that's being created for tutorials around the test, right? It all just becomes one big privatization situation.
There was a piece of good news on that front. Well, it wasn't great news, but it was good news. Offered right here in this room at the conference on the role of higher education in an unequal society. One of the researchers who gave a phenomenal presentation, and whose name I'm now blanking on, works at the University of North Carolina, basically presented a pretty compelling research evidence that that neither SAT nor ACT was a good predictor of success in college or in the workforce. and that
There's a
that
Sarah
high
Lawrence
school,
scene.
I think that high school GPA, it remains the best predictor, actually, which, having just listened to everything I've said about lousy schools, it's not necessarily great news, but what it does suggest, at least, is that if we create schools that are just schools, where the way we build instructional processes for kids and encourage kids to construct knowledge for themselves and to engage authentically with the universe around them, that if they are working hard and getting smart, then they will have demonstrated through the internal assessments of that school predictable qualities that can more accurately predict their ability to be successful long term in in higher education and in life. It sort of begs the question about colleges that have direct pipelines to counselors in private schools who send them students every year, and it's a whole other question, but one small piece of hope.
Yeah, well, there was a recent piece just about how the college boards, I think they grow out of the 1920s and tied to the eugenics movement, and they were never meant to be inclusive. They were meant to weed out the undesirables from going to college.
The same guy. Yeah, it's true.
Time for a couple more questions.
Up there?
My question. How do you teach a child ambition or initiative? How does one teach the child to want to learn, to want to have the eternal thirst for knowledge? What would be the best way to do that?
I think I would defer to the experts in the room on that one. What do you think, Steve?
Well, you quoted John Holt saying that people think most intelligently when they're most interested. And that harkens back, and I'm sure in his mind too, to Dewey and the whole idea of interest and habit that comes from into habits of mind that come from interest. So the answer is, they're naturally interested, young children. I mean, this is a simple answer. It's a very complex. But if they're allowed to follow their interests, then they will experience in an individual and organic way what it means to pursue something, to be interested in something, to find out about something, to experiment with something, blocks or whatever.
My mother did for my brother and I what Mr. Bogin's mother did for him. She used to make us get up and go to church very early every Sunday before we got a chance to read the funny papers. So one day my brother and I were like, Mom, we didn't get a chance to read the Sunday funny papers. So she goes, okay, you know what? I have a surprise for you. After church, she gives me a Superman comic book and she gave my brother a Batman comic book. Well, about 50,000 issues later, I won several national spelling bees because my vocabulary was advanced because I pursued the interest. But I also like art. So pursuing the one interest, one thing that interests you can exponentially go, like you said, to the universe.
You answered your own question.
Yes.
Better than we did.
Thank you.
And I would say also that, we have to be careful. We're the purveyors of opportunity. And so we have to determine what a healthy environment is for very young children. And we know a lot about that for like 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and infants, and 4-year-olds. Those of us who've been schooled in it are pretty good about it. And grandparents are good about it. What we are less good at is knowing what are appropriate environments for older kids. We've drawn this line that says, okay, it's time to learn how to read and write and do math and science, and the word play becomes, like kumbaya. It's like, a wonderful fighting song that has been trivialized to mean like it has no heft. Right. Same with play. And we also have to be vigilant about not taking the easy road out, the easy road with, sitting kids in front of screens. To some extent, it's easier because taking care of kids is hard, especially when you're working. And so screens become, like a babysitter, only they're not. And so I just think we have to be careful about the environments we create.
One more question.
I was going to say, I think the problem with the American society is because it's such a nuclear family. And if you're a working mom, working parent, when you come home, you don't have aunties and uncles and everybody else helping you out. And I'm a teacher, I'm also a parent. I know that I work with younger kids and my child is 7 years old, and I just need to have a moment where nobody's talking to me, because otherwise I'm gonna lose it. And the only time when my child is not talking to me, that 1 hour when I can make dinner, put it on the table, make sure that she's done, we do reading, she's bathed, she's done everything else, that it takes for me to function as a parent. I need to have that time for her to watch television, because otherwise I'll lose it, Either that or I'll resolve to something else. So I think that it's not a balanced society, so it makes it very difficult to be a working parent and to be, a good parent at the same time.
I think that's, arguably the most profound observation we've heard today. I say to my friends when they're having issues with their kids, as I sort of try to remind myself when I'm having issues with mine, that somewhere along the line we came out with a society that functions, but it's still pretty close to being certifiable as an institution, and it's very hard to make sense out of that.
Well, I would just say that 1 hour a day is not a problem. The average 7-year-old, there was just a study last week, I can't remember, that was it like 5-6 hours a day for a 7-year-old, and for an 11 or 12-year-old, like 7-8 hours a day. And the problem with that is that it's not that 1 hour, it's not that downtime, it's that we are buying in so wholeheartedly that there are infant iPads to put on the crib now, and there are just, yes. And on the potty seat, special potty chair, iPad, but also schools. Schools are using multiple screens and multiple ways of, so they are starting to find now that you know, it's that for some kids, for your daughter, probably not, and that's why I'm saying don't worry about that 1 hour. But the point is, as a society, we're doing all kinds of, that's really what you're saying, right? That we're, we do all kinds of things, we hop on all kinds of bandwagons.
Oh, Steve Jobs was interviewed one time about, here he is, this great wizard of technology and everything that rules our lives, and they asked, well, how much does his kids have all the recent Apple products? He's like, are you kidding me? I wouldn't let my kids near that stuff. So,
Yeah, I think it's really hard because the fact is we usually don't really know whether something that is being presented for a child is necessarily problematic or benign for some of the new, particularly some of the new stuff. And you don't want to be saying to your kids, no, you can't do this, 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 because the more we do that, the less we have kids who are developing their own excitement, and you never know when you're going to say to your kid, no, you can't do this, and that particular this is what is inspiring that child's fantasy world or whatever. It's a very delicate balance. But I think that the conversations around the issue are what are critical, and especially critical for people involved in schools. And that those conversations that my sense is still, thank God, happen here, are not happening enough among really intelligent people. This is the crucible issue of our time. And, and there are all sorts of other reasons why more and more people don't go into teaching, that, some of which are economic, some of which are political, but we need ongoing intelligent conversation about what appropriate instructional practices, about what appropriate environments are for kids of every age, not just 3, 4, 5, or, 7 is tough. I've got a 16-year-old at home, and I'm constantly, watching him in the living room, playing on his Xbox and wondering whether I've made a big mistake. I mean, these are conversations that people should be having with each other, and certainly in schools.
Thank you both for this incredibly intelligent conversation.